The slap landed before anyone in that emergency room could process what was happening. 1 second, Lieutenant Colonel Damon Voss was pointing his finger in a young nurse's face. The next, the crack of his open palm against her cheek silenced every monitor, every rolling cart, every murmured conversation in the Westbrook General Emergency Department. 53 people witnessed it. 53 people stood there, frozen, holding their breath, and not one of them said a single word. The nurse didn't cry. She didn't flinch away or press a hand to her reddening cheek. She simply looked at him, steady, still, with eyes that had seen things Damon Voss could never comprehend. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in the room, in him. He just didn't know it yet. If you love stories about quiet justice and strength that speaks for itself, follow my channel all the way to the end of this story. Hit like, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Her name was Sarah Vaughn, 28 years old, 5'4" in her nursing clogs. Hair pulled back in the kind of tight bun that didn't move even during a 12-hour trauma shift. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow, faint, maybe 2 centimeters. And if you asked her about it, she'd say she walked into a cabinet door at 19. She would not be telling the truth, but she'd say it with such a flat, practiced calm that nobody ever pushed further. She had worked at Westbrook General for 14 months. Before that, a gap in her resume she filled with the phrase private sector medical consulting whenever HR asked. Before that, 6 years she didn't discuss, with a unit designation that didn't appear on any publicly accessible military database. The nurses on her floor knew her as reliable, quiet, the one who could find a vein in a collapsed patient when 3 other nurses had already failed, the one who didn't panic during codes, who moved through chaos like she'd been swimming in it her whole life, which, in ways none of them understood, she had been. They didn't know her. They thought they did. The morning everything broke started at 6:47 a.m. when Lieutenant Colonel Damon Voss arrived at Westbrook General in his service uniform for what was described in the facility calendar as a routine coordination visit. He was attached to Fort Callan's Medical Liaison Division, which meant he came through the hospital periodically to review protocols for military-affiliated patient transfers. He had a handshake like a man who had practiced it in a mirror, a jaw that could have been carved from oak, and the particular brand of confidence that comes from spending 2 decades being told you're exceptional. He was also, as it happened, under quiet federal scrutiny for procurement irregularities that had surfaced 6 weeks earlier in a DoD internal review. But nobody at Westbrook General knew that, and Damon Voss intended to keep it that way. Sarah knew. Not all of it. Not the full picture. But 3 months earlier, reviewing a military patient's transfer documents, she'd flagged what looked like a discrepancy in a pharmaceutical supply authorization. The name on the authorization didn't match the unit. The unit designation didn't match the patient's service records. It was small. It was possibly nothing. She'd written it up through the hospital's proper reporting channel, a quiet 2-paragraph note to the compliance desk, and never heard back. She had kept a copy. She kept copies of everything. Old habit. The kind of habit you develop when you've operated in environments where the paperwork is the only thing that protects you. That morning, Voss had come to the hospital's administrative wing for a 7 a.m. briefing. Sarah had come in early for a double shift, which put her in the east corridor at the same time he was walking toward the conference room. She didn't stop him. She didn't say anything. She simply existed in the hallway at the wrong moment, and he recognized her from a file that had been quietly passed his way 2 weeks prior. The compliance desk had forwarded her note, not to the right people, to him. By 8:15, he had found a reason to come to the ER floor. Machab. The accusation was specific. That was what made it effective. A patient had been administered the wrong dosage of a blood thinner the previous evening. Not enough to cause serious harm, but enough to require a corrective protocol and a full incident report. The error had been logged to the night shift, traced to a medication cart that Sarah had restocked during her overlap hours. Voss stood in the middle of the emergency department and announced, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this, that Nurse Vaughn had improperly labeled the cart, overriding the automated system's dosage flag, and that her negligence had placed a patient at risk. He said all of this loudly, calmly, with the authority of a man in uniform speaking to a room full of people trained to defer to authority. Sarah said, "That's not accurate." She said it quietly, not defensively, just as a statement of fact. The same way she might say the patient's blood pressure is dropping or the IV line needs to be repositioned. Voss turned to look at her fully for the first time. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite anger. It was the particular irritation of a person who is accustomed to not being contradicted. "Are you questioning my assessment, Nurse Vaughn?" "I'm telling you what happened," she said. The cart was flagged at shift handover. "The documentation's in the system. The override came from a different login." "Your login," he said. "No." She said it without hesitation. "I can show you the timestamp." That was when he slapped her. It wasn't a strike born of rage. That was the part that stayed with people afterward, the detail that kept surfacing in hushed conversations for weeks. It was too controlled for rage. It landed on her left cheek with a crack that echoed off the linoleum in the instrument trays and the acoustic tile ceiling, and then Voss straightened his jacket and looked around the room as if checking whether anyone was going to challenge him. Nobody did. Sarah Vaughn stood there with her cheek going hot and her jaw set and her hands loose at her sides. She didn't raise them. She didn't step back. She looked at him with those level, dark eyes for a beat that felt much longer than it was. And then she looked away. Not in defeat, in the particular way of someone cataloging information and deciding this isn't the moment. She was suspended pending investigation by noon. The hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Pettis, who wore his stress like a second suit jacket, sat across from her in his office and used phrases like institutional liability and pending review and sensitive situation given the military relationship. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at the file on his desk and at the window and at the middle distance somewhere between the two. "This is a suspension with pay," he said, as if that made it something other than what it was. "The medication log will show the override wasn't mine," Sarah said. "Pull the system access records. It's a 10-minute audit. We're reviewing all documentation." The cart was handed over to the night shift at 7 p.m. I was in Trauma Bay 2 from 6:45 onward. There's a trauma record and 2 witnesses. Pettis finally looked at her. He had the expression of a man who already knew he was doing something wrong and had made peace with it. "Sarah, I understand this feels—" "I'm not asking you to understand how it feels," she said. "I'm telling you where the evidence is." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've already made a decision and are simply waiting for the conversation to be over. She walked out of his office at 12:34 p.m. with a suspension letter in a manila envelope and her badge deactivated. She stopped at her locker, took out a stethoscope and a small personal kit she kept there. Nothing sentimental, just her things, and walked the length of the hallway toward the exit. Near the ambulance bay, a man in his late 60s was sitting in a waiting area chair, clearly a patient family member, paper coffee cup in both hands, watching her with the particular attention of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people. He had the posture of someone military. Not the uniform kind, but the ingrained kind, the way weight distributes through the spine when you've carried equipment for years. Something fell from her bag as she reached for her keys. A coin. Small, brass-edged, with an embossed insignia that caught the overhead light for just a second before it hit the floor. The old man set down his coffee. He leaned forward and looked at the coin. The way you look at something you thought you'd never see again outside of very specific circumstances. Sarah picked it up without hurrying, dropped it back in her bag, and pushed through the exit door into the gray October morning. The old man watched her go. Then he took out his phone. For 8 months, Damon Voss went about his life. He received a departmental commendation in February for streamlining supply chain coordination between Fort Callan and 3 regional medical facilities, a process that had, in fact, generated a significant amount of paperwork that nobody with the right clearance level had yet closely examined. He was photographed at a charity gala in March, shaking hands with a city councilwoman. In April, a regional military affairs publication ran a profile on his career, headlined, "The Officer Who Modernizes Logistics." He had a nice house in Delway Heights. He played golf on Saturdays. He thought about Sarah Vaughn sometimes, not with guilt. That wasn't his register. More with the mild residual awareness of an unfinished administrative task. The suspension had held. She hadn't filed a formal complaint, or if she had, it had been routed quietly to the same compliance channel as her original flag and had gone nowhere. She had disappeared from Westbrook General and, as far as anyone could tell, from the healthcare system in the greater Crestfall metro area entirely. She wasn't on social media. Her apartment had been vacated. He had a talent for making problems disappear. He considered this one handled. The Harwick ferry exploded at 9:17 on a Thursday morning in June. It carried, at the time of detonation, 112 commuters crossing the Aldrin River between the Harwick waterfront and the business district terminus. The explosion was later described by investigators as a dual detonation event, 2 charges, staggered by approximately 8 seconds, which had the effect of maximizing structural failure and preventing the rapid evacuation the first blast alone might have allowed. The Aldrin River was not wide. It was, however, cold, and the current beneath the Harwick crossing was deceptive. 61 people went into the water. The ferry itself broke into 2 sections and partially submerged within 4 minutes. By 9:40, the first ambulances were arriving at Westbrook General. The ER had 12 beds in active trauma use within the first hour. By 10 a.m., there were patients in the hallways, on gurneys lined against walls, with nurses triaging in the ambulance bay before transport even completed. The hospital activated its mass casualty protocol at 10:12, which meant Gerald Pettis was in the Emergency Operations Center trying to read a checklist he hadn't actually practiced since a drill 2 years prior. The hospital's trauma director, Dr. Annika Reeves, was on her 3rd patient of the morning and had blood on her left sleeve and was operating on approximately 3 hours of sleep from the night before. She was good at her job. She was one person. At 10:23, the Federal Emergency Response Coordinator called Pettis' office line. "We're activating the Tier 1 supplemental roster for your facility," the coordinator said. "Tier 1. Okay?" Pettis looked at his administrator on duty. "What's Tier 1? "It's the Federal Mass Casualty Augmentation List. Medical personnel pre-certified for emergency command and deployment. We've authorized dispatch to your facility." A pause, brief and administrative. "The first contact on the Harwick response roster for your zip code is a Sarah Vaughn. We're sending her credentials to your intake desk now." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in an emergency operations center is a notable length of time. "Vaughn," Pettis said. "Vaughn, she should be arriving within 20 minutes. Please ensure access credentials are ready." Pettis put the phone down and looked out through the glass partition at the organized chaos below. He thought about the manila envelope, the deactivated badge, the 12-minute conversation in his office where he had not looked her in the eye. "Pull her access back up," he said quietly. His AOD stared at him. "Do it now. Full facility." She arrived at 10:41 in plain dark scrubs and a gray jacket that looked like it cost nothing. No insignia, no announcement. She walked through the ambulance bay entrance, clipped on the temporary ID that intake had printed. Her photo was in the federal system, already on file, better quality than most hospital badge photos, and stopped at the ER threshold to take in the room. She spent about 8 seconds doing that, just looking. The way you look at a complex problem before you begin solving it, not with panic or with theatrical calm, but with the particular focused stillness of someone for whom this scale of disorder is a known quantity. Dr. Reeves was coming out of Bay 3, pulling off a glove, when she saw her. "You're Vaughn?" "Yes." Reeves looked her over once. She was a doctor who had worked mass casualty events before. She did not have the luxury or the inclination to be precious about credentials in this moment. "Tell me what you see." "You've got your critical in bays 1 through 4, which is right, but your moderates are stacking in the hallway without proper positioning, and 2 of them are going to decompensate if they stay supine. Bay 7 bed has one who needs to be sitting up. There's lung involvement. Your triage point is the bottleneck because you're running 2 people there, and one of them isn't trained to the scale you need, and you need someone on chemical exposure protocol. 3 of the patients coming off the water had contact with something that isn't burn standard. The pattern on the second guy's arms is specific." Reeves stared at her for a moment. "Chemical. I've seen it before. You need your hazmat contact on the phone now, before more patients present with it, and you've got cross-contamination in here." "Okay." Reeves made a decision the way experienced doctors make decisions under pressure. Fast, committed, no wasted motion. "You've got the floor. I'm in surgery bay. You need anything, you come to me directly. I need your charge nurse, and I need the incoming manifest so I can pre-position resources. Done. Reeves was already moving. She stopped, turned back. Vaughn, good to have you. Sarah didn't answer. She was already at the triage station. The military vehicles arrived at 10:58, 3 of them. 2 dark SUVs and a larger vehicle that wasn't quite civilian and wasn't quite overt military, pulling into the rear access road with the quiet authority of something that doesn't need to announce itself. The personnel who stepped out wore dark tactical clothing with minimal identification, no unit patches visible, no rank display, the specific kind of non-uniform that means something specific to people who know what it means. The charge nurse, a large, steady man named Arlo, who had been at Westbrook General for 11 years and thought he had seen everything, watched them come through the rear access door and felt the temperature in the room change in a way he couldn't account for. The lead, a tall woman, early 40s, with the kind of face that held its expression deliberately, walked directly to the triage station, bypassing the intake desk entirely. Vaughn, she said. Sarah looked up from the manifest she was working through. Something crossed her face, recognition, and with it a particular quality of readiness that hadn't been visible before. Not that she'd been unprepared, more like a frequency had been tuned. Hargrove, she said, you were fast. Ferry incident triggered a secondary protocol. The woman, Hargrove, said it in the flat cadence of someone relaying information rather than making conversation. Aldrin River, there's federal interest. I know. Sarah set the manifest down. I need your people on perimeter, and I need one of them on the chemical exposure track. I've flagged 3 patients, and there may be more in incoming. I also need comms with whoever's running the scene investigation. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then she looked around the emergency department, at the controlled chaos, at the patients, at the staff moving fast and thin. You've got command? Hospital authorized it. A small pause. Then Hargrove said something to the personnel behind her in a tone that didn't carry, and they split off toward different positions in the room with the efficient lack of fuss of people who have done this before. Arlo, the charge nurse, had moved close enough to hear the exchange. He was holding a clipboard he had forgotten about. Later, he would describe this moment to his wife as watching someone become a completely different person, which wasn't quite right. It was the opposite. He was watching someone stop pretending to be a smaller version of themselves. By 1 p.m., the emergency department had processed 47 patients. 11 were in surgery. The hallway backup had cleared. The 3 chemical exposure cases were in isolation with the hazmat team running protocol, and 2 additional cases had been correctly identified before they could contaminate the larger treatment area. Voss arrived at 1:14. He came through the main entrance in his service uniform, which was either very confident or a significant error in judgment, depending on how much he knew about what was already happening in the building. He had been called in by Fort Callan's liaison coordinator because the ferry incident had military dimensions that someone needed to account for. Stolen materials, a name that kept appearing in the early evidence, a chain of custody that was beginning to feel uncomfortable. He didn't know Sarah was there until he was already in the building. He found out at 1:19 when Hargrove's second-in-command stepped into the hallway in front of him and said, with the courteous impassivity of someone who is blocking your path without technically blocking your path, Sir, Command wants to make you aware there's an active federal response team operating in this facility under joint authorization. Voss looked at him. I'm here on Fort Callan liaison business. Yes, sir? And you're welcome to proceed to the administrative wing. The emergency department is currently restricted to response personnel. I have authorization to be anywhere in this facility. You had authorization, the man said pleasantly. That's been updated as of this morning. Down in the emergency department, Sarah was going through the incoming manifest a 3rd time. Not because she needed to, she had already routed the remaining patients and the flow was holding, but because something in the numbered patient entries from the water rescues was snagging her attention. The 4th patient to come off the river. Water exposure, secondary trauma, mild smoke inhalation. Standard. But the personal effects logged at intake. A transit lanyard with a secondary badge affixed to it, obscured by river damage. The badge wasn't transit. She had to look twice to confirm it, and even then it was the ID format she recognized, not any visible text. a format she knew from a very specific context. Her eyes moved to the patient's listed residence, then to a notation about his personal effects bag, logged and held at intake. She stood up from the station. "Arlo?" The charge nurse materialized immediately. He had been hovering, she had noticed, processing whatever had shifted in his understanding of who she was. "The 4th Water Rescue. Where is he?" "Bay 6, stable." "His effects bag. Don't let it leave this floor. Nobody touches it without coming to me first." Arlo looked at her. Are we talking about something bigger than the ferry?" She looked at him for a moment. Arlo was a good nurse. He'd worked this floor for 11 years, and he'd pulled her through her first week here by showing her where the actual supply storage was versus where it was labeled on the official map, which turned out to be different rooms entirely. He deserved a real answer. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why nobody touches it." She moved toward Bay 6, and as she moved, she pulled out her phone with her free hand and sent a 3-word text to Hargrove. "Check patient 4. The reply came back in under 60 seconds, which told her Hargrove had already been looking. "Already on it. Stay close." The bag was logged into evidence at 2:07 p.m. What it contained wasn't immediately public. Federal investigators used language like materials relevant to an ongoing inquiry and components consistent with items reported missing from a Fort Callan storage facility in the documents that would eventually become available. But the man in Bay 6, once he was stable and alert enough to understand that 2 federal agents were sitting very quietly in chairs near his door, became cooperative with remarkable speed. He asked for a lawyer and he asked for immunity consideration. And he asked, with the particular urgency of someone recalculating their position, whether the officer he worked for had been notified. One of the agents, a woman named Price with short red hair and the disposition of someone who finds paperwork calming, looked up from her notepad. "Which officer?" The man in Bay 6 said a name. Price wrote it down. She had already heard it twice today, from 2 different directions. The 3rd time something appears in a federal investigation in a single afternoon, it stops being coincidental. She stepped outside the bay and made a call. In the hallway 20 feet away, Sarah Vaughn was standing with her back to the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, not looking at anything, just standing still for the first time in 4 hours, letting her body rest while her mind kept working. She was still in her plain dark scrubs. There was no reason, looking at her, to understand what she had done in the last 3 hours, or what she had been before those 14 months at Westbrook General, or what the challenge coin in her jacket pocket represented, or why federal personnel she had not spoken to in nearly 2 years had arrived at this hospital within 17 minutes of the emergency being called. She looked, if you passed her without context, like a tired nurse at the end of a long shift. Down the corridor, the main entrance doors opened. Damon Voss stepped through them a second time, having apparently found a route around the personnel who'd redirected him. In his service uniform, jaw set, moving with the energy of a man who is about to reassert control of a situation. He stopped when he saw her. The hallway was not quiet. There were staff moving, carts rolling, the ambient sound of a hospital in the back end of a crisis. But between Voss and Sarah, standing 30 feet apart, something happened that Arlo would also describe to his wife later. The air seemed to get very still. She looked at him. The same way she had looked at him in the emergency department 8 months ago, after his palm hit her cheek and the room went silent. Steady, measuring, without any of the things he had expected her to feel, fear or bitterness, or the particular fragility of someone who has been publicly humiliated and knows it. She looked at him like she was waiting. Price stepped out of Bay 6 and moved toward him with her identification already in her hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Voss," her voice was conversational, professionally light. "We've been hoping to speak with you. Can you come with me?" Voss looked from Price to Sarah and back again. Something crossed his face that took a moment to identify. It was the specific expression of a man watching a door close in front of him that he had believed was permanently open. "I have authorization to be in this facility," he said. His voice was still controlled, but it had changed register. That particular drop in certainty that sounds like firmness from outside and feels like something else from within. "That's fine," Price said. "This isn't about the facility." He didn't move. She waited, patient, unhurried. The way federal agents wait when they already have what they need and are simply managing the process of a man arriving at understanding. At the end of the hallway, near the entrance to Bay 6, one of Hargrove's personnel appeared in the doorway. Then another one near the stairwell. No raised voices, no dramatic positioning, just presence, in the specific geometry of people who know how space works. Voss looked at Sarah one more time. She had not moved. She was still standing with her back to the wall, arms loose at her sides, watching him with those quiet, dark eyes. No expression that could be read as satisfaction, no performance of vindication, just that stillness that had been in her from the beginning, the kind that comes not from peace, but from certainty. He looked away first. "Fine," he said. "Let's talk." Price led him toward the administrative wing, and the hallway settled back into its sounds. Carts and footsteps and monitors, and the low, continuous work of a hospital putting itself back together after the worst morning it had seen in a decade. Sarah exhaled slowly. She pushed off the wall, checked her phone, and went back to work. The effects bag from patient 4 had contained, among other items, a partial shipping manifest with a Fort Callan supply authorization code, a code that matched, with a specificity that no coincidence could explain, the discrepancy Sarah had flagged in a 2-paragraph compliance note 14 months earlier. She had kept the copy. She had kept it on a drive she had not connected to any network, stored in a way that had nothing to do with Westbrook General's systems, in a location known to one other person, a woman named Hargrove, who had called her 3 weeks after her suspension to say don't throw anything away in a tone that had told her everything she needed to know. Down in the administrative wing, Voss was in a conference room with 2 federal agents and a closed door, and the day had 2 more hours in it. And by the end of those hours, the copy of that compliance note would have been officially entered into a federal evidentiary record. Patient 4 was asking for a lawyer. The man who had handed Sarah the suspension letter was sitting in his office staring at his phone, which had not stopped ringing for 40 minutes. And somewhere in the evidence chain now unspooling across the Westbrook General Administrative Wing, a timestamp on a medication cart access log, one that had always been there, waiting for someone to actually look, showed clearly, specifically, and without any interpretive ambiguity that Sarah Vaughn had not been in that corridor at the time the override was entered. She had known it would surface. She had been patient for 8 months. And now, in the gray-walled hallway of a hospital that had handed her a manila envelope and looked away, with chemical exposure patients recovering in isolation and 47 triaged cases routed and an emergency floor running clean, Agent Price's recorder was turning in a conference room where Damon Voss had, for the first time she could remember, not looked like a man who was certain of anything at all. She went back to work. That was the thing nobody in the building quite knew how to process, that after Price led Voss down the hallway and the conference room door closed and the geometry of the day shifted in ways most of the staff couldn't fully name yet, Sarah Vaughn simply turned around, went back to the triage station, and finished her shift. Not because she felt nothing, because the work wasn't done. There were still 6 patients in the holding queue from the river rescues. One of them, a woman in her mid-50s with compression trauma to her left leg and a secondary cardiac concern that the initial triage hadn't flagged, needed repositioning and a second read on her EKG strip. Sarah caught it walking past the bay, stopped, pulled the strip from the chart, and stood there with it for about 4 seconds before telling the floor nurse to get Dr. Reeves on a consult. "She's got a prolonged QT," Sarah said. "Could be the cold exposure. Could be something we don't want to miss." The floor nurse looked at the strip, then at Sarah. "I'll call her." "Do it now, not in 5 minutes." "Right." That was how the next hour went. Small catches, adjustments, the particular work of someone who moves through a complicated system not by controlling it, but by seeing it. All of it, the whole board, and placing pressure in the right places at the right moments. Arlo shadowed her for most of it, not consciously, but in the way you stay close to the person who seems to understand what's happening. At some point he realized he'd been doing it, and felt briefly embarrassed, then decided he didn't care. At 3:30, Hargrove found her in the corridor outside the supply station. "We need a conversation," Hargrove said. Not urgently, in the tone of someone scheduling rather than demanding. "Give me 10 minutes. Take 15. The room off the loading dock. Maintenance uses it. Nobody's in there." Sarah finished the supply check, handed off her notes to Arlo, and told him she'd be back. He nodded like he was used to her disappearing for operational reasons, which he wasn't, but he was adapting. The maintenance room off the loading dock was exactly what it sounded like. Concrete floor, a folding table, two metal chairs that didn't match, fluorescent light with a faint flicker on one end. Hargrove was already there when Sarah arrived, standing with her arms crossed and her jacket still on, which meant she wasn't planning to stay long. A man Sarah didn't recognize was in one of the metal chairs. Late 40s, civilian clothes, the kind of unremarkable face that is probably cultivated rather than accidental. He had a tablet on the table in front of him, but wasn't looking at it. "This is Ellison," Hargrove said. "He's been running the supply chain audit on Fort Callan's medical procurement for the past 4 months." Ellison looked at Sarah with the measured attention of someone who has read a file and is now checking the file against the reality. "You flagged the authorization discrepancy in October last year." "Yes. Through the hospital compliance channel." "It was the appropriate channel." He nodded slowly, not agreeing with her assessment, processing it. "The report was forwarded internally within the hospital system, and then, we believe externally, to Voss." She had suspected this for months. Hearing it confirmed still had weight to it. "How long before someone intercepted it?" 11 days after you submitted it, which means he knew I'd seen it before he came to the hospital." She said it flat, not as a question. The medication card incident wasn't opportunistic. He needed a reason to discredit me that was already in my professional record. Ellison looked at Hargrove. Something passed between them. Not surprise, but the particular acknowledgement of a theory becoming a confirmed fact. "The medication log," Hargrove said. "The access record that clears you. We need it entered into the federal record cleanly. Your copy of the compliance note, too." "I can give you the drive. I've had it in an off-network location since November." "We know," Ellison said, without elaborating on how they knew, which she didn't push because she understood how that sentence worked. She looked at them both. "What's Voss saying in there?" Hargrove's expression didn't change much. "He said quite a lot, most of it about other people," which meant he was already beginning to trade. Sarah had expected that. Men like Voss didn't get to their position by being loyal to anything more durable than their own survival. The moment the room stopped being a place he could dominate, he'd start looking for exits. "The shipping manifest from patient 4, she said. "What does it connect to?" "That's what the next 48 hours are for," Ellison said. He finally picked up the tablet, looked at it briefly, put it back down. "What I can tell you now is that the authorization codes on that manifest appear in 3 other procurement records we've been building a case around. Your original flag named a 4th. Sarah let that settle. 4 records. The scope was larger than she had accounted for when she'd written that 2-paragraph compliance note in her first month at Westbrook General. "How many people got hurt today because of it?" she asked. Nobody answered that directly. Hargrove looked at the concrete floor for a moment. Ellison looked at the tablet. "We don't have a confirmed causal chain yet," Ellison said finally. "But the materials flagged in those records, specific components, are consistent with what the forensic team found at the Harwick detonation site." The room was very quiet. "I see," Sarah said. She meant it precisely. She saw the shape of it now. Not all the details, not the timeline or the full cast, but the shape. A procurement scheme that had siphoned materials over months or years. Materials that had ended up somewhere they shouldn't. A bridge between Voss's corruption and the bodies they'd pulled out of the Aldrin River this morning. "I want the access log and the compliance note in federal hands today," she said. "What do you need from me?" "A formal statement. Recorded, witnessed." Hargrove checked her watch. "We can do it here in an hour." "Fine." She stood. "I need to finish the patient handoff first." Hargrove almost said something about the statement being time-sensitive and then didn't, because she had known Sarah long enough to understand that "I need to finish the patient handoff first" wasn't negotiable and wasn't a deflection. It was just how she was built. The formal statement took 40 minutes. She sat across from a woman with a recording device and said what she knew in the order she knew it, cleanly and without inflation. The medication cart discrepancy. The compliance note. The date, the time, the channel she used, the fact that she hadn't heard back, the copy she'd kept. The October visit. The accusation. The suspension. She was precise about the slap. She described it the way you describe a physical event: contact, location on her face, force, the sound it made. She didn't describe how it felt because that wasn't what they were building a record of. The agent across from her wrote something in the margin of her notepad and kept her expression professionally neutral. When it was done, Sarah asked if she was needed on the floor, and they said she was released for the day. She found Arlo at the charge desk, handing off to the evening shift. He looked up when she appeared. "You good?" he said. "Yeah." He looked at her for a second. "Vaughn, what happened today? The whole day? What you did with the floor?" He stopped, started again. "I've been here 11 years. I've never seen someone manage a mass casualty response like that, with this staff, in this space." He shook his head. "I don't know what you were before you came here, but I've got a better idea now." She picked up her jacket from the hook behind the desk. "You did good today, Arlo. I followed you around like a lost kid. You executed. That's not nothing." She walked out through the ambulance bay the same way she'd walked in that morning, without ceremony. Outside, the parking lot was still occupied by two of Hargrove's vehicles and a cluster of unmarked sedans that hadn't been there at sunrise. The sky had gone from gray to the particular deep blue of early evening in late autumn, and it was colder now, and her breath showed. She got to her car, sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. 8 months. She'd spent 8 months in a furnished one-bedroom in a neighborhood 20 minutes from Crestfall, doing contract telehealth work under a name that appeared in no Westbrook general record, keeping herself available without being visible. She'd run in the mornings. She'd maintained her certifications. She'd waited. Not passively. Waiting, for her, was never passive. It was watching, gathering, being still in the way that a person who has operated in high-risk environments learns to be still, which is not restful, is actually the opposite of restful, is the specific discipline of not moving until movement serves a purpose. She had trusted Hargrove's 3-word call in November: "Don't throw anything away." She had been right to trust it. She started the engine and drove. The story broke at 11 p.m. that night. Not the full story. The federal investigation would take months to become public in its totality. But the initial reporting was enough. A local station ran it first, then The Wire picked it up within the hour. Senior military officer detained in connection with Harwick Ferry investigation. The details were carefully limited. Federal proceedings, ongoing inquiry, no charges yet confirmed. But the name was there. Damon Voss, Fort Callan. A procurement scheme under examination. By midnight, the surveillance footage had been anonymously confirmed to exist. Not released, not yet, but confirmed. The footage that showed, with timestamp clarity, the emergency department of Westbrook General on an October morning. The footage that showed, among other things, who was where and when. By morning, 2 of the contractors named in Ellison's procurement audit had retained lawyers. Sarah watched the 11 p.m. segment on her laptop in her small furnished apartment, sitting cross-legged on the couch with a bowl of reheated rice she'd barely touched. The anchor was careful with language, alleged and under investigation, and sources familiar with the matter, all the appropriate hedges. Her name wasn't mentioned. None of the footage had aired. There was nothing in the segment about a nurse or a compliance note or a medication card access log. She turned it off at 11:17 and went to bed. She didn't sleep well. That was not a sign of distress. She rarely slept well after a high-output day. The mental wind-down took longer than the physical, always had, a feature of her particular architecture that she had long since stopped fighting. She lay on her back and ran the day's events in sequence, checking for gaps, for things she'd missed, for the places where her decisions had been sound and the places where they'd been improvised. The QT on the cardiac patient. She'd caught it. The chemical exposure pattern. She'd called it before anyone else. The bag, patient 4, the shipping manifest. She had not been wrong about any of it. That didn't make her feel satisfied exactly, more like she could close the loop on that part and move to the next. At 2 a.m. she got up, drank water, stood at the window looking at the parking lot below. Nothing was happening. A security light flickered near the dumpsters. She went back to bed and slept until 6. Ellison called her at 8:14 the following morning. "We need you back in," he said. "Federal field office, not the hospital." "Can you be there by 10? "Yes." Bring your ID. We'll clear you at the desk. The field office was in a nondescript building in the business district that had the energy of a place that had been chosen specifically for its lack of distinguishing features. She was cleared through a lobby with 2 security checkpoints and taken up to the 4th floor, where the carpet was a shade of beige that suggested the renovation budget had run out before anyone reached this floor. Ellison was waiting in a conference room with 3 other people she didn't know. 2 of them had the look of federal attorneys, the specific combination of exhaustion and precision, and the third was a woman in her late 30s with close-cropped natural hair and the quiet authority of someone who holds institutional weight without needing to announce it. Special Agent Dara Nkosi, the woman said, extending a hand. I've been overseeing the Fort Callan audit since March. Sarah shook it. Vaughn. I know. Nkosi gestured to a chair. Sit down. We have a lot to get through, and I want to start with what we found in Voss's office records last night. They had moved fast, faster than she'd expected, which meant the Harwick explosion had unlocked resources and authorizations that the slower-burning procurement audit hadn't had access to. Mass casualty events do that. They change the bureaucratic weather. Voss's records, Nkosi said, setting a folder on the table, show a pattern of authorization codes that appear in supply orders going back approximately 3 years. The codes are legitimate. He had the clearance, but the quantities don't reconcile with the receiving records. Material left the Fort Callan supply chain and doesn't appear in any downstream inventory. My compliance note named one of those codes, Sarah said. It named one of the most recent transactions. Which is part of why Voss moved against you when he did. Nkosi looked at her directly. You weren't supposed to see it. You weren't in a position that should have had access to that authorization structure. How did you? Sarah thought about how to answer that. Transfer documentation for a patient who came through our facility from Fort Callan, medical transport. The supply authorization was attached to a pharmaceutical order that was part of the transport packet. It was visible to anyone processing the paperwork, which most people wouldn't read carefully. I read everything carefully. One of the federal attorneys shifted in his chair, not impatiently, more the movement of someone recalibrating an assessment. Here's where we are, Nkosi said. Voss is cooperating but selectively. He's given us 3 contractor names and a partial timeline. What he's not giving us, or claims not to have, is the origination point, where the diverted materials ended up before they reached the Harwick site. She paused. Forensics is going through the ferry wreckage now. We'll get there, but the faster we build the paper trail, the cleaner the prosecution. What do you need from me? Sarah said. Walk me through every interaction you had with Voss, not just October. Any contact before that. Any documents that crossed your desk with his authorization signature. Any patient records from Fort Callan transport that you processed in your 14 months at Westbrook General. Nkosi opened a notepad. We'll record this, we'll type it up, and you'll sign it. And if there's anything you remember about the materials flagged in those records, anything from your previous service experience that would help us contextualize what we're dealing with, I'd like to hear that too. She said the last part carefully. Previous service experience, not naming a unit, not referencing anything specific. But Hargrove would have briefed her, which meant Nkosi knew who she was talking to. Sarah looked at her for a moment. What's your clearance level? Nkosi said a number quietly. It was sufficient. Then yes, Sarah said. Let's start at the beginning. Trot. They were in that room for 4 hours. She was precise in a way that the federal attorneys found, she could tell, slightly unusual. Not because witnesses were typically imprecise, but because she narrated events in the specific, temporally anchored way of someone who had been trained to debrief. Time, place, personnel present, what was said, what was documented, what was inferred, and what was confirmed. She didn't editorialize. She didn't describe her emotional state during the October incident. At one point, Nkosi asked, when he struck you, was there anyone in your immediate vicinity who you believe witnessed the contact specifically, not just the aftermath? The charge nurse on duty, a resident whose name I have, and a patient family member who was in the waiting area, civilian, male, approximately late 60s. Former military, I'd estimate. He saw the challenge coin when I dropped it leaving the building. Nkosi wrote something down. Do you have any identifying information for the family member? No, but he saw it clearly. He knew what it was. How do you know he knew? The way he reacted, Sarah said. He'd seen one before. Nkosi looked at her. There was a brief silence in the room that had a different quality than the other silences. Something had been established without being stated. All right, Nkosi said. We'll follow that up, son. She was leaving the field office at 12:48 when her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered it because she answered unknown numbers, another old habit. Is this Sarah Vaughn? A man's voice. Older, graveled, the way voices get when someone has spent decades talking through wind and noise. Who is this? My name is Walt Dupree. I was at Westbrook General yesterday. My son was in surgery there. He's all right. A brief pause waited with something he wasn't putting into words, but that she could hear. I saw you leave. I saw what you dropped. She stood on the sidewalk outside the federal building's unremarkable front entrance and said nothing for a moment. She knew who this was. Mr. Dupree, she said. I know what that coin means, he said. I was Army, long time ago, before most of what you carry now even existed, but I know the shape of service when I see it. Another pause. I saw what he did to you, in that hallway. I've been thinking about it since October. Her jaw tightened slightly, not with distress, with the specific discomfort of being witnessed. I was going to stay quiet, Dupree said. My son needed surgery that morning. I had other things on my mind, but then I saw the news last night. His name. And I made some calls this morning to find out who I'd talk to if I wanted to give a statement. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, a pigeon was doing something entirely ordinary on the sidewalk 6 feet away, and the normal city sounds continued without any acknowledgement of the conversation happening inside them. Mr. Dupree, she said, I'm going to give you a name and a number. Her name is Special Agent Nkosi. She's going to want to hear from you. I figured, he cleared his throat. That thing you did yesterday with the ferry. The news didn't say much, but my son's nurses were talking. I heard what you managed in there. A long pause. You carried it right. I just wanted you to know someone noticed. She didn't know what to say to that in a way that wasn't either dismissive or more than she intended. So she said, Thank you for calling. Yes, ma'am, he said. It was the automatic honorific of a former soldier, and it sat in the air between them with a strange and uncomplicated dignity. She hung up and stood there for another moment. The pigeon left. A cab went past. The city continued. She dialed Nkosi's direct line. I have a witness for the October incident, she said when Nkosi picked up. Walt Dupree. He's already looking to give a statement. He's going to call you. Dupree. Nkosi repeated it, and Sarah could hear her writing. How credible. Former Army, 30 years minimum would be my read. He was in the waiting room. He had eyes on the whole thing. She paused. He noticed the coin. Another beat of silence, then, okay, I'll take the call. Sarah hung up and walked to her car. Seeing what she didn't know, what she wouldn't know until 48 hours later, when it came through a secure channel in the kind of communication that has no subject line, was that Voss had spent the previous night making a second calculation. He had been cooperating selectively, as Nkosi said. 3 names. A partial timeline. Enough to demonstrate goodwill, not enough to eliminate his own leverage. But at some point in the early hours of the morning, something had shifted. Possibly he had spoken to his lawyer. Possibly the scope of what Ellison's team had found in his office records had been conveyed to him in terms he could no longer manage around. Possibly it was the news report at 11 p.m., which told him the story was already airborne and could no longer be contained. Whatever it was, at 6 a.m., he had asked to speak to the lead investigator again, and he had given them a name that wasn't a contractor, a name at a level above his own, a name that, when it ran through the federal system, connected to procurement decisions that went back 5 years before Voss had ever touched a supply authorization code. He hadn't given it willingly. He'd given it because the alternative had become untenable, but he'd given it. Nkosi had stared at it for a while, then called Ellison, then called her supervisor, and the morning had taken on a different shape than anyone had been expecting. The supply chain didn't end at Fort Callan. That was what the name meant. It meant the diversion had been happening longer across more facilities with higher authorization than a 3-year audit of one officer's records had begun to suggest. Sarah wouldn't know this for 2 more days. But in the federal building she had just left, on the 4th floor with the beige carpet and the humming fluorescent lights, Agent Dara Nkosi was sitting in front of a name on a piece of paper and understanding that the case had just become something significantly larger than what it had been the day before. And the materials that had ended up at the Harwick ferry site hadn't been the end of the supply chain. They had been, as best forensics could determine, a test. The name Voss had given them was Brigadier General Marcus Hale. Not Hale as in related to Sarah. The name was coincidence, the kind that federal case files occasionally produce, and nobody mentioned it because it wasn't relevant. What was relevant was that Marcus Hale had overseen medical logistics for 3 regional military installations for the past 7 years, which meant his authorization signature appeared on enough procurement documentation to make the Fort Callan records look like a footnote. Nkosi briefed Sarah on this 46 hours after the field office meeting, in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes and was recorded on both ends. "This changes your exposure," Nkosi said, not as a warning, as information. Voss gave us Hale specifically because Hale's network is wider and the federal interest in shutting it down is significant. That means this case gets elevated. More resources, faster timeline, but also more visibility. Your name is going to surface. I expected that. When it does, the narrative around October is going to become public. The suspension. What he did to you in that ER. You need to be prepared for that. Sarah was standing at her kitchen counter with a coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Outside her window, the Crestfall morning was doing its ordinary thing. Traffic, overcast sky, the sound of a garbage truck making its way up the block. "I'm prepared," she said. A pause on Nkosi's end. Not hesitation, consideration. "We're executing a search warrant on Hale's installation records today. If what Ellison's team thinks is actually there, we're looking at a secondary diversion network. Materials that left the Fort Callan chain went somewhere before Harwick. We think that somewhere is a staging location." Nkosi paused again. "We need your read on the chemical signature from the ferry site." Sarah set the coffee down. "What specifically?" "The forensic report on the detonation materials came back this morning. The compound profile is," Nkosi seemed to select the next word carefully, "unusual. There's a component the lab flagged as modified, not standard military supply chain material, something that was altered after leaving official inventory." "Send me the profile." "I can't send it to an uncleared line." "Then get me cleared for it." Another pause, longer this time. "That requires a formal reinstatement of your access credential. That's not something I can authorize." "Who can?" "That request would need to come from Hargrove's command." "Then talk to Hargrove." Sarah picked up the coffee, finally, and didn't drink it. "I spent 3 years working with materials in exactly the environment those compounds come from. I know what modification means in that context, and I know what it doesn't mean. You want to understand what Harwick was. Whether it was a capability demonstration, a product test, an isolated event, or a signal, then you need someone who has seen the unmodified version in operational use." She set the cup down. "That's not a common skill set." Nkosi said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, "I'll make the call." The credential reinstatement came through at 2 p.m. The forensic profile arrived 40 minutes later through a secure portal that someone had stood up specifically for this purpose, which told her the elevation of the case was moving faster than standard bureaucratic speed, which meant people above Nkosi's pay grade were now actively involved. She read the profile twice. Then she sat very still for a while. The compound wasn't just modified. It had been stabilized, a process that required specific equipment and specific expertise, neither of which should have been accessible through any civilian channel. The stabilization method was one she recognized because she had seen the documentation for its military application during a classified technical briefing in her 4th year of service. She had not seen the documentation since. The method was not supposed to exist outside of 2 facilities in the continental U.S., both of which were monitored at a level that made unauthorized access theoretically impossible. Theoretically. She called Nkosi. The stabilization process in that compound, she said when Nkosi picked up. Who's running your technical analysis? DoD Forensic Lab. Why? Because what I'm looking at isn't a field modification. It requires controlled conditions, a specific reagent sequence, and at minimum one person with graduate-level chemistry training in an environment with stable temperature regulation. She heard Nkosi start to say something and kept going. This wasn't assembled in a storage unit. Whoever produced this had access to a functioning lab, and the method they used should not exist outside of government inventory. Nkosi's voice went flat in the particular way that indicated she was processing something she didn't like. You're telling me this was produced by someone inside? I'm telling you the method is not civilian, whether the person is still inside or was formerly inside. Sarah stopped. That's what the search warrant on Hale's record should tell you. If Hale's network had access to a facility with these conditions, that facility will be in his documentation somewhere. Equipment orders, maintenance contracts, utility accounts. It won't be labeled what it is, but it'll be there. A sharp silence. Then Nkosi said, I need to get off this call. Go. She hung up. Sarah sat with the phone in her hand and the forensic profile still open on the secure portal and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone assembling a picture they didn't want to finish, that the Harwich ferry bombing hadn't been an endpoint. It had been a proof of concept. Hargrove called her at 4:17 p.m. How fast can you be at the federal office? 45 minutes? Make it 30. She made it 32, which was within operational tolerance. The fourth floor of the federal building was different than it had been 2 days prior. More people, more activity, the particular elevated noise of an investigation that had shifted from building to moving. Someone had brought in a rolling whiteboard that was covered in a network diagram she could see partially from the hallway. Hargrove met her at the elevator. Hale's records had a property lease, Hargrove said, moving before Sarah had fully stepped off the elevator. The way you move when you've got simultaneous operations running and standing still costs something. Commercial space, registered to a Shell LLC, 40 minutes outside Crestfall. Utilities consistent with laboratory-grade climate control. Lease started 4 years ago. Sarah walked beside her. Has anyone been to the site? Federal tactical team is staging now. We go in at 6. Hargrove glanced at her. Nkosi wants you on comms. If there are materials at the site that need field assessment before the lab team arrives, whether they're stable, whether the space is safe to enter, she wants your read before she sends anyone in. I'm not certified for active tactical entry. You're not going in. You're on comms with the team leader. Hargrove pushed open a door into a room where Nkosi was at a table with 3 other people and a laptop showing a satellite image. But you need to be here now. Nkosi looked up when she entered. She had the tight, functional expression of someone who had slept 3 hours and was running on the particular fuel of a case breaking fast. Vaughn, the site is a converted warehouse unit. Satellite shows no thermal signature currently, which is either because it's been cleared or because the insulation is military grade. Either way, we don't know what's inside until we look. What does Hale say? Hale's been unreachable since 8 a.m. His aide says he's in a classified briefing. We have reason to believe that's not accurate. Nkosi's jaw tightened slightly. We think someone told him the warrant was coming. The room absorbed that. Someone inside the investigative chain, or someone close enough to it to move faster than the warrant. If the site's been cleared, Sarah said, what does that mean for the materials? It means they moved them. Nkosi turned the laptop so Sarah could see the satellite image more clearly. There's a loading dock on the north end. Tire track impressions in the last 48 hours. We got that from a drone pass at 0600 this morning. Something left the site. Sarah looked at the image. The loading dock. The dimensions of the building. The access road. She traced the road on the screen with one finger, not touching the laptop. What's the nearest population center in the direction of this road? Nobody answered immediately. One of the analysts at the table pulled up a map. The road ran northeast. The nearest population center in that direction, at the scale they were looking at, was the Kellard River Corridor, a dense urban stretch connecting Crestfall's northern district to the suburb of Morrow Falls, approximately 60,000 residents. The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. How much material could a vehicle moving from this dock carry? Nkosi asked her. Directly, without softening the question, because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from softening. Sarah looked at the dock dimensions, at the tire track impressions, at the access road. If they were moving finished product, she said, enough. The stabilized compound doesn't require volume. It requires precision. She stopped. This isn't about another explosion. A compound stabilized that way isn't optimized for structural detonation. The modification changes the dispersal profile. Nkosi was very still. Dispersal. You'd use it differently. You wouldn't blow a target. Sarah pressed her mouth closed for a moment, working through the language. You'd introduce it into an environment where exposure could be controlled, or could appear controlled. A closed space. A ventilation system. Something where the onset of effect is slow enough that it's not immediately identifiable as deliberate. The analyst at the map had gone still. Nkosi stood up. What's in the Kellard corridor in the next 72 hours that involves large enclosed populations? Someone pulled up a city events calendar. Conference center, 2 concerts, a high school regional athletics tournament with 12 schools participating. And on the 3rd day, a scheduled military accountability hearing at the Crestfall Federal Courthouse. Open to the public, media credentialed, expected attendance several hundred. Nkosi looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls, her voice dropping into the flat, rapid register of someone transmitting information that cannot wait. Hargrove had already moved to the door. Sarah stood at the table looking at the satellite image and the map and the city calendar, and understood that whatever she had set in motion 8 months ago by writing 2 paragraphs in a compliance note, whatever chain of cause and effect had run from that October morning to this room, it was not finished. The ferry had been 47 injured, 11 in surgery, bodies in the river. What was moving northeast on that road, if she was right about the compound, if she was right about the intent, could be something else entirely. Nkosi's voice cut across the room. Vaughn. She had the phone against her chest, not covering the mic, just pausing. The accountability hearing. Is there any reason, given your knowledge of what Hale's network knew about the investigation, that the hearing would be a specific target? Sarah looked at her. She thought about Voss in the conference room giving up Hale's name. She thought about Hale's aide saying he was in a classified briefing. She thought about someone inside the chain who had known the warrant was coming. Yes, she said. Why? Because Voss gave testimony that names Hale. Hale knows it, and the hearing is where that testimony becomes part of a public record. She paused. If you wanted to stop a case from surviving to prosecution, you'd want to stop it before the record exists. Nkosi looked at her for one long second. Then she said into the phone, I need the courthouse on the list. Full sweep, starting tonight. She turned away. The room had become fully operational now. People moving, phones going, the rolling whiteboard being updated in real time. Hargrove had gone. The analyst was pulling satellite imagery of the Kellard corridor, building by building. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that, by the format of the message structure, she recognized as one of Hargrove's secondary communication protocols. Warehouse site clear. Materials gone. Tracks northeast confirmed. Team leader needs your read on compound behavior in confined HVAC systems. Call this number now. She called the number. A man's voice answered on the first ring, tight and precise, already in motion somewhere loud. Vaughn? Yes. Walk me through what we're looking for if the compound's been introduced into a ventilation system. Detection thresholds, symptom onset, what it looks like before someone knows to look for it. She moved toward the corner of the room where the noise was lowest and started talking. And somewhere northeast of them, on a road that connected a loading dock to 60,000 people in a federal courthouse, something was moving. The man on the phone was named Carver, and he had the focused economy of someone conducting a pre-entry assessment in real time, which meant he needed information in a format he could use, not information in a format that demonstrated how much she knew. So she gave it to him straight. If the compound's been aerosolized and introduced into an HVAC system, onset at standard commercial airflow rates is between 40 and 90 minutes, depending on building volume and the concentration used. Early presentation looks like a respiratory irritant, mild eye irritation. Some people get a headache, maybe a dry throat. It's easy to attribute to dry air or allergies. The window where it's symptomatic but not yet identified as exposure is the dangerous period because people stay in the space. What tips it past that window? Progressive. Tightness in the chest that doesn't resolve with water. Then coordination issues, subtle at first, the kind that reads as lightheadedness. If the concentration is high enough and the space is enclosed, you start seeing confusion and muscle weakness after 2 to 3 hours. At that point, you're dealing with a mass exposure event that looks like a lot of other things before it looks like what it is. Detection. What do we need? Standard hazmat air monitors won't catch the modified compound on first pass. The stabilization process changes the spectral signature. You need someone to manually set the detection threshold parameters, or you'll get a clean reading on contaminated air. She paused. Does your team have access to the Fort Callan hazmat protocols? The modified threshold parameters should be in the 2019 technical supplement. A brief silence. I'll get that pulled. One more. What deactivates it in an HVAC system? Full system shutdown and purge with positive pressure ventilation. But you can't just shut the system down and leave it. The compound settles in ductwork and re-aerosolizes when airflow resumes. You need a physical decontamination of the duct system before it goes back online. She thought for a second. The courthouse has a building management system. If you can get access to that remotely, you can kill the HVAC before the compound reaches distribution threshold. But that only works if it was introduced recently. How recently? Within the last 6 hours, if the building's been running at standard daytime airflow. After that, you're decontaminating a distributed system. Okay. She could hear him moving, relaying something to someone beside him. We're on site at the courthouse in 40 minutes. I'll flag the detection parameters. Get the building management access first, faster than waiting for hazmat entry clearance. Copy that. A pause that had something in it. Not quite gratitude, which wasn't the register of this kind of call, but the specific acknowledgement of someone who has been handed exactly what they needed. Vaughn, good read. He hung up. She stood in the corner of the 4th floor room and let the call settle for a moment, and then she went back to the table where Nkozi's team was working. The next 3 hours were the particular kind of tense that doesn't look like tension from the outside. People at laptops, people on phones, a board being updated with locations and timestamps, coffee appearing and going cold, and Nkosi moving between stations with the contained urgency of someone managing multiple simultaneous threads and not letting any of them drop. Sarah stayed. Nobody asked her to leave, and she had nowhere she needed to be. She sat at the end of the table with a notepad that she didn't write much on and tracked the incoming information as it arrived. At 6:23, Carver's team made entry to the warehouse site. It was empty, as anticipated, cleared fast, the kind of fast that suggested advance warning and practiced logistics. They found chemical residue consistent with the compound's production process, which told them the site had been operational recently. It also told them the quantity produced was larger than what had been used at Harwick. The forensic estimate, which Nkosi read aloud from a message on her phone in a voice that stayed level with effort, was 3 to 4 times the volume of the Harwick event. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Courthouse team, Nkosi said, and someone across the table picked up a radio. At 7:02, Carver reported access to the courthouse building management system. HVAC offline within 4 minutes. The system had been running since 6 a.m. 12 hours of airflow. He was running detection on the intake ducts with manually adjusted parameters. Sarah watched the clock. She knew what the result would be before it came back because the math of the timeline was specific, and the people who had moved those materials knew the math too. They'd known when the system would need to be running to reach threshold by hearing day. They'd calculated backward from a target time. The detection came back positive at 7:19. Compound present in the north intake duct, concentration below active threshold. Introduced sometime in the past 4 to 6 hours. Not yet distributed through the full system. They had gotten there in time, not comfortably, not with margin to spare, in time. Nkosi exhaled, a single controlled breath, and said, "Get hazmat on the full decontamination, and I want 24-hour security on that building until the hearing is concluded or relocated." Then she looked at Sarah. Your read on the detection parameters saved us 6 hours of misreads. Sarah said, Who introduced it? We don't know yet. Someone with access to the building, maintenance, security, contracted services. Someone Hale's network had placed or turned. She looked at the board. If they know the courthouse is compromised and we responded, they know the primary target failed. They'll have a contingency. Nkosi was already nodding. We're running background checks on every contracted employee with building access in the last 30 days. That's the right call, but it takes time. Sarah looked at the board a moment longer. Where is Hale right now? That, Nkosi said with controlled irritation, is a question I have been asking since 8 o'clock this morning. Marcus Hale surfaced at 9:47 p.m. Not by choice. A Crestfall patrol unit responding to a report of an erratic driver on the interstate northeast of the city made contact with a vehicle registered to a shell company that Ellison's team had identified in Hale's property records that afternoon. The driver was not Hale. He was a man named Torrance Bellew, 41 years old, former military supply clerk with a discharge that had been quietly processed 4 years prior, under circumstances that nobody at the time had looked at closely enough. Bellew was cooperative in the way people are cooperative when they're frightened and isolated and have run out of contingencies. He'd been driving for 6 hours. He didn't know exactly what was in the sealed containers in the back of the vehicle because he'd been told not to ask, which he'd understood to mean he wouldn't want to know. Hazmat was on scene within 35 minutes. The containers held the remaining compound, the volume that hadn't been introduced into the courthouse ductwork. It was enough, the lead hazmat technician told Nkosi over the phone, to characterize as a significant quantity. He used the word significant in the careful way of someone who doesn't want to use the words that would be more accurate. Bellew, sitting in the back of a patrol car on the shoulder of the interstate with the particular expression of a man understanding that his life has just reorganized itself into a before and after, told the first federal agent who spoke to him that he'd been given the vehicle by a man at a private airfield 12 miles east of the warehouse site. What man? The agent asked. Bellew described him. Height, build, age, a specific identifying feature. A scar across the left knuckle of his index finger, a visible one. The agent photographed the description and sent it to Nkosi. Nkosi sent it to Hargrove. Hargrove looked at it and called Sarah. The description Bellew gave, Hargrove said. Does it match anyone in Hale's known associate network from your service period? Sarah read it. She read it again. Something tightened across her chest that wasn't quite recognition, but was in the same neighborhood. The scar detail, she said. That's specific. Yes. I've seen a scar like that on one person, but he died. 2019 training accident, Fort Callan. I read the report. Silence on Hargrove's end. The particular silence of someone deciding how much to say. The report, Hargrove said finally, was filed by Marcus Hale's office. His name was Edmund Rask. The death record was real in the sense that it existed in a database and had a signature on it. The body was less real in the sense that the incident report had relied on the testimony of 2 people, both of whom were subsequently contracted by a company whose ownership traced back to the same LLC structure as Hale's warehouse. Ellison had found this at 11 p.m., having been running the LLC chain since mid-afternoon. He called Nkosi. Nkosi called Hargrove. Hargrove drove to the federal building and was there when Sarah arrived at midnight, having been called in from the apartment she'd barely been back to. The 4th floor at midnight looked like a different version of the same room. Fewer people but higher concentration, the specific staffing of a case that has crossed into emergency hours. Rask, if alive, was a former military chemist with the exact technical background required to produce and stabilize the compound. He had worked under Hale's command for 3 years before his documented death. His expertise, in the 2 years prior to that death, had shifted from standard military chemistry into a specialization that required the kind of facility the warehouse had been. He's been running the lab, Ellison said. He was at the whiteboard with a marker, connecting nodes on the network diagram in a way that had a different character now. Denser, more complete. The death record was Hale's exit strategy for him. Get him off the books. Out of any traceable connection to the supply chain, operating under a new identity while he produces product for the network. "Where is he now?" Nkosi said. "Bellew said he was at the airfield. We have units there. The airfield has 2 registered aircraft, both accounted for. Neither has filed a flight plan in the last 12 hours. If he's there, he's still there." Or he was told about the courthouse response and he ran. Nkosi's jaw worked. "Hale. Someone is feeding Hale information. We have a leak somewhere in this chain." The room processed that. It wasn't comfortable to process. Sarah had been standing at the edge of the whiteboard looking at the network diagram. She tracked the nodes. Hale at the center, Voss as a downstream operator, Rask as the technical production arm, the shell companies as financial architecture, Bellew and people like him as logistics. It was a system that had been running for years with no single point of obvious failure, which meant it had been designed by someone who understood how investigations worked. "The leak," she said. "How many people knew about the warehouse warrant before it was executed?" Nkosi looked at her. 6, plus whoever they briefed. "And how many people have known my name in connection with this case since the field office meeting?" A different kind of silence. "Because if someone in this chain has been feeding Hale information since at least the courthouse," Sarah said, "and Hale knew the warrant was coming, then Hale also knows my name. He knows what I identified from the forensic profile. He knows I'm the reason the courthouse detection parameters were corrected." She looked at Nkosi. "If he has any operational capacity left, I'm a logical next target. Not because I'm a threat in a physical sense, because I'm the evidentiary thread that connects everything." Nkosi didn't rush to dismiss it. That was one of the things about her. She evaluated what she heard rather than reacting to it. "We can place protective detail on you." "I don't need protective detail." Sarah looked at the whiteboard again. "I need the airfield covered, and I need Rask's description out to every transit hub in range. If he runs tonight. If he doesn't run, it's because he thinks the network is still functional enough to complete something." "Complete what?" "The courthouse is decontaminated. Bellew's in custody with the remaining product." "Remaining product," Sarah said. "You're assuming that's all of it." Ellison had gone still at the whiteboard. "The warehouse residue suggested a production run significantly larger than what we've accounted for," she said. "The courthouse introduction was a fraction of the total volume. Bellew was transporting the largest remaining quantity, but he was given it at the airfield, which means someone separated it from Rask and gave it to Bellew for transport, which means Rask might not have been moving product at all." "He was staying with the facility," Ellison said slowly. "We're staying with a remaining quantity that nobody has found yet, because we assumed Bellew's vehicle had everything that wasn't already in the courthouse ductwork." She looked at Nkosi. "What else is at that airfield?" Nkosi was already on her phone. The answer came back in 8 minutes. The airfield had a maintenance hangar on its south end, leased to a company that appeared when Ellison ran it in under 3 minutes, in the LLC ownership chain. Not prominently. Third tier, obscured under 2 holding companies. The kind of structure designed to survive a first-pass audit and fail on a deeper one. The federal team at the airfield had focused on the main structure and the aircraft. The maintenance hangar had not yet been searched. Carver was redirected at 12:38 a.m. They found Rask at 1:04 a.m. Not running, not armed, or at least not visibly. He was in the maintenance hangar, sitting at a workbench with a laptop and the specific expression of a man who has been waiting to see which way this goes. He was 47 years old, thinner than Bellew's description had suggested, with the kind of face that in another context might belong to a professor or a librarian, unremarkable, precise, the face of someone who spent most of their time in concentration. The scar on his left index finger was exactly as described. He did not resist. He looked at Carver's team when they came through the door and said, with the flat affect of someone who had already run the calculations, "I want to speak to whoever's running the federal side." "You'll get that opportunity," Carver said. "I want to speak to them before I speak to a lawyer." Rask looked at the laptop, then closed it. "Because what I have to tell them is time-sensitive, and by the time lawyers are involved, it won't matter." Carver called Nkosi. Nkosi called it in 40 seconds. "Bring him in. Now, Sab." Rask arrived at the federal building at 2:11 a.m. and was put in a room with Nkosi, Ellison, and a recorder. Sarah was not in the room. She was in the adjacent observation space, watching through the glass, which was where she wanted to be. He looked different through the glass than she'd expected from the descriptions. Smaller. Not weak, but compressed. The physical expression of a man who had lived in hidden spaces for 5 years. He started talking before Nkosi had finished reading him his rights, which Nkosi noted and which he acknowledged. He said he understood his situation. He said he understood it in the specific way of someone who has thought about this moment for a long time and has decided what he's going to do when it arrives. The quantity Bellew moved wasn't the full production, he said. Bellew didn't know that. He was given what Hale told him to move. Where's the remaining quantity? Nkosi said. Rask looked at the recorder. I need an immunity agreement on the production charges. I know how much weight the federal prosecutor will want to put on me for the Harwick event. I wasn't the architect of that. I was the chemist. There's a difference, and I need it recognized. That's a conversation for... I understand the process. He leaned forward slightly. But I'm telling you now, before that process starts, that the remaining product is at a location I will give you tonight. It needs to be in federal custody tonight because Hale doesn't know I've been picked up yet, and when he finds out, the person he'll call to move that product will move it. What person? Rask said a name. It was not a name Sarah recognized, but Ellison, on the other side of the glass, made a movement she saw. Not quite a flinch, more the involuntary physical response of someone hearing something they'd been trying to find for months. He stepped out of the observation room, came back 30 seconds later, leaned close to her and said quietly, "That name is on the procurement audit. Not as a primary actor, as a signatory on one document. We ran it in March and flagged it as a potential connection, and then it dropped in the prioritization because we couldn't build enough around it." Who is he? Ellison looked through the glass at Rask, who was watching Nkosi with patient attention. He's a current civilian contractor with active building access credentials for 7 federal facilities in this region. He paused, including the Crestfall Federal Courthouse. She understood immediately. He didn't just introduce the compound. He's the one who placed it. He has legitimate access, no breach required. Which means Hale can tell him to move the remaining product to another facility, and he can walk in with it. Ellison was already moving toward the door. I need to get that name to Nkosi now. He went through the door into the interview room. Nkosi received the information without breaking composure, wrote something on her notepad, and said to Rask, "The individual you named, where does Hale contact him?" "Through a channel I can show you." Rask looked at the notepad Nkosi had written on. "But you need to do something first." "What?" "Make sure Hale doesn't know I'm here." His voice remained flat, but something in his eyes was different, a specific urgency that the flat effect was barely containing. "Because if Hale knows I've been picked up before you get to that contractor, Hale won't call him to move the product. He'll call him for something else." "Such as?" "To clean up." Rask looked at the recorder. "There are 2 people in this building right now whose testimony is the core of your prosecution. Without them, the case against Hale is circumstantial." He paused. "I've been in this network for 5 years. I know how it operates when it feels cornered." Nkosi was very still. "Who are you referring to?" Rask looked at the mirror. He couldn't see through it. He was looking at his own reflection, but the direction of his gaze was precise, and it was not accidental. "The nurse," he said, "and the man in your custody named Voss." The protective detail went on Voss first because he was already in a controlled facility and the logistics were faster. 2 additional agents on his detention unit, access restricted to cleared personnel only. Sarah was in the 4th floor conference room when Hargrove came to her at 2:47 a.m. and said, without preamble, "We need to move you." "I'm not leaving." "Vaughn, if I leave this building, I'm not available to assist with whatever Rask gives you next." She looked at Hargrove. "He came in offering information. He's going to keep giving it incrementally to protect himself. You need someone here who can evaluate the technical content fast enough to act on it." Hargrove looked at her with the expression of someone managing competing obligations. "You understand what Rask is saying about the contractor." "I understand it, which is why moving me to an undisclosed location where I'm out of communication doesn't help anyone." She met Hargrove's eyes directly. "Put your people on the doors and the elevator. I'll stay in this room." It wasn't ideal. Hargrove knew it wasn't ideal. But she also knew Sarah well enough to understand that the argument would cost more time than the compromise. "Two people outside this room," Hargrove said. "You don't go anywhere without one of them." "Agreed." Hargrove left. Two of her personnel materialized in the hallway outside the conference room door within minutes. Sarah sat down, poured cold coffee from a carafe that had been sitting since before midnight, and drank it without particular feeling about its temperature. At 3:09, Rask gave Nkosi the contact channel, an encrypted messaging platform accessed through a specific account that Hale used under a pseudonym. Ellison's team was on it in under 10 minutes, and what they found there, over the course of the next 40 minutes of systematic extraction, was the operational record of the network going back 3.5 years. Messages, logistics, transaction records, coded, but not coded well enough for people who now had context. The authorization codes from the Fort Callan procurement records appeared in the message thread repeatedly. The Harwick event was referenced obliquely in 2 messages dated 5 months prior. Planning language, the specific vocabulary of operational preparation. And in a message sent 14 months ago, the week before Voss had appeared at Westbrook General to accuse a nurse of a medication error, a single line from Hale's account to Voss's. The flag came from WBG. Handle it before the quarter review. Handle it. Nkosi read it twice. Then she sent it to the federal prosecutor who had been on standby since midnight. At 4:15 a.m., Marcus Hale was located at his residence in the Delway Heights neighborhood, 4 miles from where Voss had lived, which was the kind of geographic detail that would mean nothing to most people and a great deal to the investigators who had been building this case for months. He had not fled. He was home, which suggested either that he didn't know how far the night had progressed, or that he had calculated he could manage whatever came. He opened the door in a bathrobe to 4 federal agents and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I want my lawyer." "That's your right," the lead agent said. "Please come with us." He was in federal custody by 4:40 a.m. The contractor, whose name was Philip Grath, whose building access credentials were suspended at 3:30 a.m., before he'd been contacted or notified, was picked up at his apartment at 4:55, still asleep, which indicated either that Hale hadn't managed to reach him or hadn't tried. His phone, examined with the emergency authorization that had been prepared and signed at 3:45, showed a call from Hale's personal number at 3:22 a.m. that had not been answered. Hale had called. Grath had slept through it. The remaining compound was located at 5:30 a.m. in a storage unit registered under Grath's name in the East Crestfall district, 3 miles from the courthouse. Hazmat teams secured it at 6:10. By 7 a.m., the arrests were confirmed. Hales, Grath, 3 additional contractors identified through the message thread. Voss remained in custody with additional charges being formulated. Bellew was cooperating fully. Rask's immunity negotiation was underway. The case, as Ellison described it to the prosecutor at 7:20 a.m., he had gone from a procurement fraud investigation into a federal terrorism-adjacent prosecution in approximately 72 hours, which was either very fast or very slow, depending on your perspective of what had been at stake. Sarah was still in the conference room when Nkosi came in at 7:35. She had not slept. She had not left the room except once, accompanied, to use the restroom. She was sitting with her jacket on and her hands around another cup of cold coffee and looking at nothing in particular. Nkosi sat down across from her, not formally, in the way you sit across from someone when the formal portion is over. "It's going to be public within hours," Nkosi said. "The arrests, the courthouse event, the warehouse. The prosecutor is managing the release timing, but there's a limit to how long you contain something with this many moving parts." "I know. Your name is going to be in it." Nkosi looked at her steadily. "The way the story reads, a nurse who flagged a discrepancy, got suspended, ended up being the person who identified the compound, corrected the detection parameters, reconstructed the network logic. That's the shape of what the reporting will find." Sarah didn't say anything. "You're going to have a choice about how much of that you engage with." Nkosi paused. "I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm telling you it's coming." "I know," Sarah said again. Nkosi looked at her for a moment. "Is there anything you need right now?" Sarah thought about it honestly. She was tired in a way that went past the night's sleeplessness. The kind of tired that had accumulated over 8 months and a career's worth of high-stakes maintenance. Her face was neutral, in the way faces go neutral when the person behind them is managing more than they're showing. "I need to know that the accountability hearing still happens," she said. "Not relocated, not postponed, that Voss testifies on the public record about Hale, that it doesn't get managed into a quiet plea." Nkosi looked at her for a long moment. "The prosecutor wants a trial. Everything in those message records, everything Rask gives us, every procurement document, it goes on the record publicly." She paused. "Voss testifying about Hale is part of the prosecution's case structure. It's not going to be negotiated away." Sarah nodded. "Once." "Then I'm okay," she said. At 8:14 a.m., the external media inquiries began arriving at the federal building's press contact. By 9 a.m., 2 national outlets had connected the Harwick Ferry investigation to the Fort Callan procurement audit to the arrests of a brigadier general and a current federal building contractor. By 10 a.m., someone had pulled the suspension record from Westbrook General's public administrative filings and connected it to a nurse whose credentials appeared in the federal emergency response documentation from the day of the ferry event. Sarah's phone began ringing at 10:23 a.m. She looked at it. Unknown number. Then another unknown number. Then a number she recognized as belonging to a regional news outlet. She turned the phone face down on the conference room table. Across town, in a secured holding facility, Damon Voss was sitting in a room with his lawyer, looking at a charging document that had grown considerably overnight and understanding for the first time the full dimensions of what Hale's network had built around him, and through him, and, at the end, against him. He had thought he was managing a loose end. He had been, the whole time, a component in something he hadn't fully understood. And the loose end he had tried to eliminate, the quiet nurse with the careful eyes and the compliance note she hadn't thrown away, had done what she'd been trained to do in environments he had never operated in and couldn't fully comprehend. She had held her position. She had watched. She had preserved her evidence and waited for the right moment. And then, when the moment came, she had worked. His lawyer was saying something. He wasn't listening. At 10:47 a.m., the surveillance footage from Westbrook General's emergency department on an October morning 14 months prior was formally entered into the federal evidentiary record. Both the prosecution and the defense received copies simultaneously, as required. The footage showed clearly and without interpretive ambiguity the moment of contact, Voss's palm, Sarah's face, the reaction of the room. It showed her walking away. It showed the timestamp. It also showed from a camera angle that Voss had not considered when he chose that location for the confrontation, the specific expression on his face 3 seconds before the strike, the deliberate calculation of it, the decision being made, visible in the particular set of his jaw and the direction of his eyes. Not rage, not reaction, intent. The prosecutor, watching the footage at 10:52 a.m., in his office, noted this detail in the margin of his legal pad, underlined it once, and moved on to the next item in the evidence package. The document that would become the centerpiece of the public accountability hearing was already being formatted. And somewhere in it, on page 47 of a federal evidentiary supplement, was a 2-paragraph compliance note written 14 months ago by a nurse who had read a transfer document more carefully than anyone expected her to. The note had been timestamped at 6:23 p.m. on an unremarkable Tuesday in October. It had been submitted through the proper channel. It had never been answered. It had started all of this. And now, at 11:04 a.m., Westbrook General's Administrator Gerald Pettis received a call from the hospital's legal counsel informing him that the federal investigation had formally requested all personnel records, suspension documentation, and system access logs relating to a former employee, effective immediately, and that the hospital's cooperation was not optional. Pettis sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended. He had a photograph on his desk of his department heads at last year's hospital gala. Voss was in it, on his left, shaking hands with the councilwoman. Pettis was smiling. He turned the photograph face down and picked up the phone to call his own lawyer. Pettis's lawyer called the federal prosecutor's office at 11:47 a.m. to confirm full cooperation. That was how these things ended on the administrative side, not with drama, not with a confrontation, but with a phone call between two lawyers arranging the terms of an institution's surrender. Westbrook General would produce every document requested, every access log, every suspension file, every internal communication that had touched Sarah Vaughan's name in the 14 months she'd worked there and in the months after she left. The hospital's legal exposure was significant, and Pettis knew it, and the speed of his compliance was the specific speed of a man trying to get to the front of a line before the line got longer. Sarah didn't know about that call when it happened. She was asleep. Not in the federal building. Hargrove had finally physically walked her to a vehicle at 8:30 a.m. and driven her to a hotel 4 blocks away that had been booked under a name that wasn't hers, and she had gotten into a bed that wasn't her own and had slept for 6 hours without moving, which was the sleep of someone whose body had simply stopped negotiating. She woke at 2:40 p.m. to 17 missed calls and a text from Nkosi that said, "Pettis cooperating. Surveillance footage public in 1 hour. Call me when you're up." She sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the thin afternoon light coming through the curtains and read the text twice. Then she called Nkosi. "The footage cleared you completely," Nkosi said without preamble. "The medication card access log is in the federal record. The override timestamp is confirmed to a login that wasn't yours. It was a shared maintenance credential that Voss's network had access to through a contracted IT service. It was deliberate." Sarah had known this. She had known it for 14 months. Hearing it confirmed in a federal context was different than knowing it. It had a different weight, a different location in the chest. "What's the public timeline?" she said. "Footage went public 40 minutes ago. The prosecutor's office released a statement. Your name is in it, not the footage itself. They didn't release you by name in the visual, but the statement identifies you as the whistleblower whose compliance report initiated the procurement audit chain." Nkosi paused. "It also describes the suspension as an act of deliberate retaliation connected to the broader conspiracy. That's formal language. That's on the record." Outside the hotel window, Crestfall was doing its ordinary afternoon thing, entirely unaware that she was sitting 4 floors above it in a room that smelled like someone else's laundry. "Voss," she said. "Charged formally this morning. Assault, obstruction, conspiracy to commit fraud, accessory to the procurement scheme." His lawyer entered a not guilty plea as a formality. We all know what the trial will look like with the message records and Rask's testimony. Nkosi's voice carried the particular flatness of a professional who has learned not to editorialize, but something underneath it had a different quality. Satisfaction was too simple a word for it. More like the relief of a load-bearing structure finally being relieved of weight it had been holding too long. Hale is charged federally, 7 counts, including the terrorism-adjacent classification on the Harwick materials. His lawyers are already trying to negotiate, but the prosecutor isn't in a negotiating posture. Grath. Cooperating. He'll serve time. Less than Hale, more than Bellew. Nkosi paused again. Rask's immunity covers production charges. He'll testify. He knows he's going to spend years in a room being debriefed about everything he built, which is its own kind of sentence. Sarah stood up, walked to the window, pulled the curtain back a few inches. Gray afternoon sky. The top floors of the building across the street. 1 pigeon on a ledge doing nothing of consequence. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, meaning it exactly that much. Not more, not performed, just the word and what it carried. "You did the work," Nkosi said. "I want you at the accountability hearing. Not as a witness, we have everything we need. As a presence. Your choice." Sarah thought about it for a second. "When is it?" "Rescheduled. 3 weeks." "I'll be there." The next 3 weeks were not quiet in the way she would have wanted. They were busy in the way the aftermath of public exposure is always busy. Calls, requests, an interview request from a national publication that she declined, a call from a military affairs journalist she also declined, a message relayed through Hargrove from someone senior in the DoD requesting a debrief and discussion of future roles that she didn't decline but didn't immediately answer either. Her face was not on television. The prosecutor's office had been careful about that, and she was grateful for the care. Her name was in print. Several articles got the broad shape right. Nurse, compliance note, suspension, vindication. And the details varied in ways that told her which ones had done actual reporting and which ones had assembled inference from the public documents. She read 2 of them, decided the information to distortion ratio wasn't worth it, and stopped reading. Walt Dupree called her on the second day. "My son watched the news," he said. "He figured out who you were." "How is he?" "Good. Home. He's—" A pause, the particular vocal weight of a father who has recently been very frightened and is now on the other side of it. "He's good. We're grateful." She didn't know what to say to gratitude that was this specific. She said, "I'm glad he's recovering. I gave my statement to Agent Nkosi," he said. "Everything I saw. I told them about the coin." "I know. She told me. I wasn't sure after October whether it mattered, whether saying something would—" He stopped. "I should have said something that day." "You were in a waiting room because your son was in surgery," she said. "You didn't owe me anything." "No," he said, "but I've been thinking about it since, about what it means to see something wrong and decide it's not your problem." A long pause. "My statement's not going to be the thing that puts him away. You already did that, but I'm glad it's on the record." She thought about telling him that it mattered, that a civilian witness who had no stake in the outcome, no institutional obligation, had picked up the phone because he'd seen something wrong and decided it was his problem. That kind of thing tends to matter to juries in ways that documented evidence alone sometimes doesn't. That 53 people in that emergency room had stood there and said nothing, and he'd been the one who'd gone home and carried it. But she didn't say all that. She said, "It matters, Mr. Dupree." He said goodbye. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after. The accountability hearing was held on a Tuesday in late autumn, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Harwick explosion, in the main chamber of the Crestfall Federal Courthouse, the same building whose ventilation system had been decontaminated in the dark hours of a Wednesday morning by a hazmat team working off detection parameters she'd given over the phone to a man named Carver. The chamber was full. Not uncomfortably full. The gallery had seating for 200, and nearly all of it was occupied by the time the proceeding opened at 9 a.m. Journalists in the credentialed section, civilian observers, people who had been on the Harwick ferry or whose family members had been. A row near the back occupied by personnel Serra recognized as federal investigators and their support staff. Arlo from Westbrook General's emergency department in the 4th row, wearing a jacket he'd clearly pressed. She sat 3 rows from the front, on the end of a row, in a dark blazer over dark slacks. Hargrove was 2 seats to her left. Between them sat a woman from the DOD's Inspector General office who had flown in from Washington the night before and had introduced herself by first name only, which was the kind of introduction that means something specific. The proceeding opened with the presiding federal officer outlining the scope, not a trial, but a structured public accountability proceeding in advance of formal prosecution, where key evidence would be entered into the public record and key testimony would be heard under oath. It was a mechanism that existed for cases where the public interest in transparency was significant enough to require a formal airing before the slower machinery of trial. Voss testified first. He came in wearing civilian clothes, which was the right read. His rank had been suspended pending prosecution, and walking in uniform would have been the kind of gesture that accelerates a jury's opinion. He sat with his shoulders pulled back in the old military posture, which was involuntary by now, the body carrying what the mind was trying to let go of. His lawyer was directly behind him. He testified for 2 hours. The procurement scheme, his relationship with Hale, the message, handle it before the quarter review, and what he had understood it to mean. He did not look at Sarah while he testified. She watched him the whole time. What he said was damaging to Hale in specific, documented, named ways. He wasn't doing it out of remorse. Remorse wasn't his register, and she wasn't under any illusion about that. He was doing it because it was the only remaining card in a hand that had otherwise been played out. The prosecutor had made the terms clear: full testimony on Hale's network and operational structure in exchange for cooperation credit at sentencing. It wasn't mercy, it was arithmetic. When the testimony reached October, the Westbrook General visit, the medication cart, the compliance note, the presiding officer asked him directly, "At the time you initiated the confrontation with Nurse Vaughn in the Westbrook General Emergency Department, Were you aware that her compliance report had been forwarded to you prior to your visit? Voss said, Yes. And the accusation regarding the medication error, was that accusation accurate to your knowledge at the time? A pause. His lawyer didn't move. The room was very quiet. No, Voss said. Was the purpose of the accusation to discredit Ms. Vaughn in response to her compliance report? Another pause. Longer. The arithmetic being calculated one more time. Yes, he said. The chamber absorbed it. No audible reaction. The proceeding was formal enough that the gallery held itself. But something shifted in the room's atmosphere that Sarah felt physically, a change in pressure. She sat very still. She had known this was true for 14 months. She had known it in the way you know something you've documented and can prove. Hearing it said aloud by the man who had done it, under oath, on a public record, in a room full of people, that was a different experience than knowing it. She couldn't have predicted exactly how it would feel. It felt like something being set down, like a weight she hadn't known she'd been compensating for, simply not disappeared, but relocated, out of her body and into the room where it belonged. She breathed in slowly and breathed out, and kept her face neutral and kept watching. Hale testified in the afternoon. He had a different approach than Voss. Where Voss had been calculating, Hale was controlled in a way that suggested legal preparation at a high level. Everything he said technically true in a narrow sense, nothing he said volunteering a single additional fact. His lawyers had coached him for precision. It didn't matter as much as he'd hoped, because Nkozi's team had the message records, and every narrow technical truth he offered had a corresponding documented fact that widened it back out. The prosecutor walked him through the message thread with the patience of someone who doesn't need the witness to cooperate because the evidence is already speaking. When the prosecutor reached the line, handle it before the quarter review, and asked Hale to explain what he had intended to communicate, Hale said it was standard administrative language about personnel management. The prosecutor set the message record down and picked up a second document. This is a procurement authorization signed by you 3 weeks after that message, in which a contracted IT service with access to Westbrook General's maintenance credentials was extended and expanded. Can you explain the timing? Hale's lawyer objected to the framing. The presiding officer overruled. Hale looked at the document. I authorize many procurement contracts. This one specifically, the prosecutor said, was for the contracted IT service, whose maintenance credential was used to create the medication cart access log entry that was falsely attributed to Ms. Vaughn. Did you know at the time of authorization that that credential would be used for that purpose? The room was very quiet. I authorized a service contract, Hale said. I understand. Did you know the purpose to which it would be put? He looked at the prosecutor. He looked at the document. The weight of the documented chain, the message, the authorization, the access log, the suspension, the compliance note, Rask's testimony, Voss's testimony, the warehouse, the compound, Harwick, was visible on his face in the way that weight only becomes visible when it can no longer be distributed. I want to consult with counsel, he said. You may, the presiding officer said. We'll take a 15-minute recess. In the gallery, nobody moved much during the recess. Hargrove leaned slightly toward Sarah and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. Arlo, from the fourth row, caught her eye when she turned briefly. He gave a small nod. Not performative, just acknowledgement. She nodded back. The 15 minutes passed. Hale came back to the stand and said, through his lawyer reading a prepared statement, that he would be invoking his rights on all further questions and that his full testimony would be reserved for the formal trial proceedings. The prosecutor said, Thank you, General, set his notepad down. No further questions for this witness. He didn't need any. The jury would see the documentary record and the 15-minute recess and Hale's face during it. Walt Dupree testified at 3:45 p.m. He was 71 years old and walked with a slight stiffness in his right hip and wore a button-down shirt that looked like it had been ironed by someone who cared about the job. He sat in the witness position and identified himself and gave his account with the directness of someone who has been thinking about what he'd say for 3 weeks and is now simply saying it. He described the emergency department on an October morning, his son's surgery, sitting in the waiting area, looking up when the sound, that specific sound, cut through everything else. I've heard confrontations in my life, he said. Military service, long career. I know the difference between a reaction and a decision. He looked at the chamber, not at any specific person. What I saw in that room was a decision. He made a choice, and 50-plus people in that room, including me, made the choice to say nothing. He described the coin. I spent 30 years in uniform, he said. I know those insignia, and I know what it means when someone carries one of those quietly, without advertising it, without using it as a shield. It means they served somewhere they can't talk about, and they did it without looking for credit. He paused. I should have said something that day. I want to say it now, on record. What was done to that woman in front of those people was wrong. Not complicated, just wrong. He was in the witness position for 11 minutes total. When he stepped down, the chamber's silence had a different texture than it had had before. Not the formal quiet of procedure, but the particular quiet of people who have heard something that costs something to say. The proceeding closed at 5:20 p.m. The presiding officer entered into the public record, the surveillance footage, the access logs, the compliance note and its timestamp, the procurement documentation, Rask's full deposition, the message chain, the forensic report on the Harwick materials, and the physical evidence recovered from the warehouse site and Grath's storage unit. She stated formally, for the record, that the suspension of Sarah Vaughn from Westbrook General had been a documented act of deliberate retaliation, that the accusation leveled against her had been false and known to be false by the person who made it, and that her compliance report had initiated a chain of federal investigation that had led to the prevention of a mass casualty event and the dismantling of a multi-year procurement fraud and materials diversion network. It was the language of a formal record. It was not poetry, but it was permanent. Sarah sat in her row and listened to it and said nothing. Outside the courthouse afterward, the afternoon had gone cold and clear, the kind of late autumn sky that is very blue and very far away. A group of journalists held positions near the bottom of the steps, but respected the barrier that the federal officers had established, which meant the space immediately outside the door was, briefly, manageable. Nkosi found her first. "It's done," Nkosi said, not triumphantly, in the tone of someone marking a fact. "Trial's still ahead," Sarah said. "Yes, but the record's made. Everything that happened to you is on the permanent public record of this proceeding. Whatever the defense tries at trial, they can't undo what was said today." Nkosi looked at her for a moment. "How are you?" It was a question Sarah hadn't been asked much in the last 3 weeks, in a way that meant it genuinely. She considered it. "I'm okay," she said. And then, because that wasn't quite complete, "I'm tired, in a way that's different than it was." Nkosi nodded. She understood that kind of tired, the kind that comes after rather than during, when the adrenaline structure that has been holding everything up finally doesn't need to anymore. The DoD Inspector General officer appeared at Sarah's shoulder, the woman who had introduced herself by first name only, who had been in the row beside her all day without saying much. "Dr. Hargrove's command submitted a formal recommendation," she said. "Reinstatement of your access credentials at the level they were when you separated, and a request that you consider a consulting role with the Medical Response Division." She handed Sarah a card, plain, institutional, a name and a number. "Take whatever time you need, but the offer doesn't expire." She moved on without waiting for a response, which was the right read. Sarah looked at the card, put it in her jacket pocket next to the place where the challenge coin usually sat. Arlo materialized from the direction of the steps, slightly out of breath in the way of someone who has been trying to navigate a crowd politely. "I took the afternoon off," he said. "I see that. Wasn't sure if you'd—" He stopped, started again. "The floor misses you. That's not a line. The people who worked with you. They asked me to say it if I saw you." She looked at him. Arlo, who had shadowed her through the worst mass casualty event Westbrook General had seen, who had caught her coffee order wrong twice and apologized for it more than necessary, who had been in the 4th row today in a press jacket because he'd decided this mattered. "Tell them I said thank you," she said. "You could tell them yourself," he said carefully, not pushing, just leaving it on the table. She looked at the courthouse steps, at the city beyond them, at the blue distance of the afternoon sky. "Maybe," she said. Tsui. The sentencing came 4 months later. Voss. 11 years federal. Assault, obstruction, conspiracy. His rank was stripped formally before sentencing, which meant he entered the system as a civilian, which was its own kind of consequence for a man who had worn a uniform for 23 years and understood his identity to live there. Hale. 22 years. The terrorism-adjacent classification held. His lawyers had argued the compound was never successfully deployed and that the Harwick event had not been ordered by him directly. The judge noted that 17 people had died in the Aldrin River and 47 had been treated for injuries, and that the material Hale's network had diverted had ended up in the ductwork of a federal courthouse. 22 years. Grath. 6 years. Cooperation credit applied. Bellew. 3 years. Suspended to supervised release in recognition of full cooperation from the point of arrest. Rask spent the next 2 years in a secure facility, being systematically debriefed by people from 3 different federal agencies, which was the immunity he'd negotiated. He did not serve civilian prison time. He lived in a kind of institutional limbo that was neither freedom nor incarceration, which was probably the most accurate accounting of his particular role in what had happened. The 6 contracted individuals identified through the message thread received sentences ranging from 18 months to 4 years. The shell company structure was dismantled and the assets frozen under federal forfeiture proceedings. The Fort Callan supply chain was audited in its entirety over the following 18 months, which identified additional irregularities predating Hale's involvement and led to a broader DoD review that was still ongoing when spring arrived. Gerald Pettis resigned from Westbrook General in February, citing personal reasons, which was accurate in the way that personal reasons is always accurate when the alternative is being asked to leave. The hospital's board issued a formal statement acknowledging that the suspension of Sarah Vaughn had been improperly executed and that the hospital's internal reporting mechanisms had failed. It was careful legal language that said everything and nothing simultaneously. It was on the public record. She went back to the emergency floor at Westbrook General on a Thursday in March. Not as a hire, she hadn't decided that yet, and the DoD consulting role was still something she was thinking about. And there was a version of her future that didn't involve either of those things, but something she hadn't named yet. She went back because Arlo had called her and said Dr. Reeves wanted to speak with her, and she respected Reeves enough to show up. Reeves met her in the hallway outside the main ER entrance. She looked the same as she had during the ferry response, the kind of person who burns so consistently that they've stopped being aware of burning. "I want you on the Emergency Preparedness Oversight Committee," Reeves said. No preamble. She wasn't a preamble person. Not nursing, not clinical, command and protocol. And we're rebuilding the mass casualty response framework from the ground up after everything the ferry event exposed about our gaps. I need someone who has actually run a MCI at scale and who understands both the medical and the tactical side. Sarah looked at her. Why not someone from the Federal Response Division? Because I don't want someone from a federal division. I want someone who knows this floor, who knows what the actual constraints are when you have 12 beds and 47 patients. Reeves met her eyes. The ferry would have been worse. You know how much worse. Sarah did know. She'd run the numbers in her head during the quiet hours of 3 different sleepless nights. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. Reeves started to turn away, stopped, looked back. For what it's worth, what you did in October, writing that note. Not because you knew where it would go, just because it was wrong, and you documented it. She paused. That's harder than people think. Most people see something wrong and decide the cost of saying so is too high. Sarah didn't answer that directly. There wasn't an answer that wasn't either too much or not enough. I'll let you know about the committee, she said. She drove home in the early evening, the city going past her windows in the way cities do when you've been inside something large and have come out the other side. Ordinary, continuous, entirely indifferent to what you've been through, traffic and streetlights, and a coffee place on a corner with a sign in the window. She thought about what Reeves had said. Most people see something wrong and decide the cost of saying so is too high. That was true. She had known it was true from the first moment she'd written that compliance note, not because she'd calculated some heroic ratio of risk to righteousness, but because the alternative was pretending she hadn't seen it, and she'd never been able to do that. Something in her was wired wrong for that particular kind of convenience. She saw things. She wrote them down. She kept copies. It had cost her a job. 8 months of precarious invisibility. A slap in a room full of people who said nothing. It had also, in a chain of consequences she couldn't have predicted from that initial 2-paragraph note, stopped something significant from happening to people who had no idea they needed stopping. She wasn't comfortable claiming that as a narrative of personal heroism. It hadn't felt like heroism at any point. It had felt like maintenance, like the stubborn, unglamorous work of a person who refuses to let the wrong version of events become the permanent one. She wasn't extraordinary. She was just precise and patient and unwilling to throw things away. The challenge coin was in her jacket pocket. She'd carried it every day for 6 years, through environments that nobody at Westbrook General had known existed, through an October morning and 8 months of furnished apartments and a night when someone had decided she was a loose end. It had been in her pocket through all of it, not as a talisman, not as a reminder of valor, as a fact. She had done those things. She was the person who had done those things. No accusation, no suspension, no slap in a room full of witnesses could retroactively make that not true. She stopped at a light. The city moved around her. She thought about the 53 people in that emergency room who had been silent. She didn't hate them for it. She understood the mechanics of silence in a room where authority is being performed, the way power distributes itself and people calculate, in fractions of seconds, what speaking up will cost them. She had stood in that calculation herself in contexts they would never know about. She was not a person without fear. She was a person who had learned, in very specific and uncomfortable circumstances, that fear and action are not mutually exclusive, that the moment you speak up is almost never the moment you feel safe enough to do so, that waiting for safety before acting is a good way to wait forever. The light changed. She drove. She took out her phone at the next light and pulled up the card the DOD Inspector General officer had handed her outside the courthouse. The number was there, plain and specific. She put it back down. She thought about Arlo in the 4th row with his pressed jacket, about Dupree saying I should have said something that day, with the weight of a man who has carried that sentence for months, about Nkosi's voice on the phone at 8 a.m., saying you did the work in the flat tone of someone who means it exactly and nothing more. She thought about the committee Reeves had offered, the consulting role, the version of herself that went back into the building with a different title and a different mandate, and built the thing that would make the next mass casualty event slightly less catastrophic. The version of herself that used what she knew, not the classified parts, not the operational history, but the specific, practical, floor-level understanding of what breaks and why and how to build systems that account for human error without punishing human beings for being human. She had spent 6 years doing classified work and 14 months doing the ordinary work of a nurse on an emergency floor, and 8 months doing the invisible work of a person waiting for the right moment. She was 30 years old. She was tired. She was in the particular way of a person who has come through something hard and is still standing, starting to understand what she wanted to do with what she had left. She pulled into her parking space and sat in the car for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. "This is Vaughn," she said when the call connected. "I've been thinking about the consulting role. I have some questions about the scope." The evening was cold and clear and entirely ordinary around her, and the city went on being itself. And somewhere in a federal correctional facility, a man who had once stood in an emergency room and made a decision was beginning his sentence. And somewhere in a crestfallen neighborhood, an old soldier was watching the evening news with his son. And somewhere in a building on the 4th floor with beige carpet, a case was being closed and another one was being opened. And all of it was true at the same time, and none of it was simple. She had not asked for any of it. She had just refused to look away. And sometimes, not always, not cleanly, not without cost, that is enough.